About 2 decades after the Battle of Endor, the Star Wars galaxy was invaded by aliens from extragalactic space. I put together a compilation of some of my best videos about the Yuuzhan Vong. As always, I've cut the fluff and sponsored segments out of these videos, and you can skip around using the timestamps below. Let's get started. The Yuuzhan Vong invaded the galaxy in 25 ABY, and in a 4-year war killed hundreds of trillions of beings, including of course Chewbacca, while also devastating the Star Wars galaxy. The question we'll be talking about today is why? We know the Yuuzhan Vong were a highly fanatic and warlike species, so that explains the why somewhat, but what caused them to invade? The new Jedi Order tells us that this wasn't just a small portion of the Yuuzhan Vong civilization, rather the entire race traveled the intergalactic void in massive warships for thousands of years, having abandoned their ancestral galaxy. The intro for the series actually gives us our first little hint, and that is, long ago a devastating war destroyed much of the Yuuzhan Vong's galaxy and cut them off from the Force, sending their clans across the intergalactic void in search of a new home. Now, they are at the edge of the Star Wars galaxy, ready to invade. That is, unsurprisingly, a very simplistic representation of what actually happened. Today, I'll share with you guys some additional details. Unfortunately, what I can't give you is exact time frames, how long exactly the Yuuzhan Vong left, how long they were traveling, etc. Trader, for example, calls the time period incalculable millennia. And similarly, the new Jedi Order sourcebook describes the Vong's history as being lost to time, though also mentions thousands upon thousands of years of conflict. It's actually the essential chronology which will provide us with our first look at the history in a broad sense. I'll summarize. Originally, the Yuuzhan Vong faced hordes of ancient mechanical enemies, and we'll touch on them later, but essentially, that war drove their hatred of machines and also made them very aggressive and warlike as a species when they weren't already. Their war against the machines also started their fanaticism as they turned to organic technologies and also the gods which they believed powered that. However, the war wiped out not only the 2 droid races which were fighting, but also most of the galaxy's other sentient beings, with some minor exceptions like the Chazrak, who served as the Vong's frontline warrior. Subsequently, we get a major event in Yuuzhan Vong history, which is the Kremlavian War, an intra-species conflict, which saw even more destruction across the galaxy as the Yuuzhan Vong, now again one of the only remaining species, killed each other on a massive scale. As we learn in Vector Prime, this is where, for example, the devastating Yogon's core technique was developed. Here's a quote from Vector Prime. Yogond was a legendary general among the Yuuzhan Vong, the one most often given credit for turning the tide in the Kremlavian War and thus uniting the various Yuuzhan Vong tribes in generations lost past. His core tactic had proven a decisive blow in that long ago conflict, destroying YUUZHAN, the home planet of the most powerful tribe, and killing nearly all of the obstinate leaders in one fell swoop. And for those wondering, the Yogon's core technique is basically what killed Chewbacca. A Dovin basil, which can manipulate gravity, is placed on a planet. It then grabs a moon or other stellar body and pulls it to the surface, causing massive destruction. The essential chronology builds on this description, stating that during and after the conflict, the Vong's warrior society even further became more aggressively religiously fanatic. Then, finally, over thousands of years of minor conflicts, they bled their galaxy dry, were forced to create a fleet of world ships which they could use to travel the intergalactic void, looking for a galaxy to inherit. The Vong's actions and their violence resulted in them being cut off from the Force. The unifying force tells us that when the Vong's original homeworld of Yuuzhan was destroyed during the Kremlavian War, the species was stripped of its connection with the Force. Now I understand that the acts of the far outsiders may have been nothing more than a reawakening of the evil my parent experienced when its symbionts used its creations not merely to defend Yuuzhan, but to launch an era of bloodshed that resulted in the death of countless worlds, among with many latent planetary consciousnesses. But I did not pursue those stirrings, those suspicions, until Zenoma became lost in the unknown regions, and, through Nenyem and Harar, I comprehended that the Yuuzhan Vong had been stripped of the Force. My most grave misgivings were confirmed when I learned of the bioweapon that was being hurled at Zenoma. That quote specifically is also from the Unifying Force and talks about the severing of the connection between Yuuzhan Tar and the Yuuzhan Vong and why they lost connection to the Force. But to summarize at this point, there was a massive war between droid civilizations, with the Yuuzhan Vong caught in the middle. They did eventually win, but they also went on to become evil and genocide their galaxy. Following that was the Kremlevian War, a Vong civil war, which saw unparalleled destruction, including many planets like Yuuzhan Tar, then finally further years of civil war and conflict such that the Vong destroyed most of their galaxy's resources and were forced to leave. So we have covered most of that, but I do want to loop back and talk about the original war which spurred the Yuuzhan Vong into aggression. That's only alluded to a little bit in the New Jedi Order and other source books, but is fleshed out pretty significantly in the new Essential Guide to Droids. According to the Great Heap page, the Great Heap was an Abominor, an ancient and evil droid species, which was malevolent, self-constructing, and from another galaxy. The endnotes to this book confirm that the other galaxy is the Vong, and that the species about to be mentioned too is the Yuuzhan Vong. The Abominor consumed everything, continually growing in size, sometimes even dwarfing planets. They exterminated species across the galaxy while feeding, and eventually fought a war against the Silentium. This war devastated the galaxy until the Vong defeated both. The Silentium were a much more peaceful race, and unlike the Abominor, were dedicated to order. They didn't seem to be outright aggressive, but contributed to the galaxy-wide destruction caused by the war. Interestingly, both the Silentium and the Abominor too fled their galaxy and showed up in the Star Wars galaxy.
Do you think the Empire would have been able to quell the Yuuzhan Vong incursion into the galaxy more effectively than the New Republic? And that's sort of a complicated question, and one they talk about in the novels. I'm sure if you're interested in this topic, you've probably read the quote from Han Solo, basically saying that, yeah, the Empire would have invented some massive project and it wouldn't have worked. And I mean, there's definitely potential to that, but let's go a little bit deeper. First of all, the one thing I always hear people say is that the Yuuzhan Vong wouldn't have invaded during the time of the Empire. And yes, there are some hints or even outright statements in the New Jedi Order that the Yuuzhan Vong timed things so they'd attack when things were sort of most softened up for them, but they really could have timed things better. They could have attacked halfway through the Thrawn campaign and completely taken both sides by surprise at their weakest. The New Republic at this point had not only made peace with the Empire, but even started information sharing campaigns, as we see at the end of the Thrawn duology. Really, the New Republic was most softened up by the presence of spies in the galaxy like Nomenor, who were purposefully finding and knocking on fault lines. The fact is, the Yuuzhan Vong were never really sure if they were going to invade. That's something revealed in the second to final novel. Before Supreme Overlord Shimra, the prior Overlord actually wanted to either do a smaller invasion or look for another resting point. But more directly onto the question. First of all, the New Republic did have the resources to beat the Yuuzhan Vong. I mean, we see that because they managed to do so. The Yuuzhan Vong were in a very difficult position in that they had to pierce the galaxy through the space called Vector Prime, establish a beachhead, start to regrow their technology and biots, all while facing enemies on all sides. The main weakness of the New Republic was a lack of response from New Republic High Command. Borsk Valia sort of did a Mass Effect Council move where he called the threat of the Yuuzhan Vong, if not totally imaginary, which we do see in the first couple of books, at least vastly over-exaggerated as a means to shift political power either to the Jedi or others within the government. I think the Empire, as with the New Republic, ruled by a completely rational, competent individual who fully recognized the Yuuzhan Vong, could have had them eliminated without the massive casualties which resulted from the Yuuzhan Vong War. But there are also some caveats. People act like the New Republic or the Empire, having acted rationally, could have met the Yuuzhan Vong fleet and simply decimated them in single combat? I don't really think that's the case. The Yuuzhan Vong were arguably the most effective early on in the war simply because their technology was so novel. Coral skippers, for example, the Yuuzhan Vong main starfighter, weren't actually very dangerous as the war progressed. Yuuzhan Vong ships use a biot known as a Dovin basal, which generates miniature black holes. Dovin basals do everything from powering the ship's propulsion to providing shields to ripping shields off nearby enemy starfighters. And we see, for example, with Kip's dozen, even when a super elite squadron encountered the Yuuzhan Vong early on in the war, they were absolutely decimated. They didn't know how to get around this technology. Later, the New Republic and the Galactic Alliance developed both techniques and technologies of their own to help bypass some of the Yuuzhan Vong's strengths. For Dovin basals, for example, they'd essentially shutter their lasers at a lower power, overwhelming the black hole while also often firing missiles or torpedoes. But there were many technologies like this. The Yuuzhan Vong also made use of Yamosks, war coordinators. These were psychic entities which essentially coordinated vessels and warriors during battle, and it made early Yuuzhan Vong fleets incredibly effective until the New Republic developed countermeasures. Again, any sort of blitz by the New Republic or the Empire is going to have to face the full might of untested, incredibly effective Yuuzhan Vong technology. In a way, the New Republic almost benefited from letting the Jedi and smaller strike forces go in, get small victories, suffer losses, but none great enough to actually destabilize the entire galaxy so that the information could be gleaned. However, by the time the Yuuzhan Vong were mounting a full invasion and pushing towards the galactic center in Coruscant, they had supply lines set up, they were growing technology across thousands of captured Vong-formed worlds, and by that point, it was a little too late. The Empire, at the height of its power, certainly had more raw force than the New Republic, especially if you consider super weapons, but the New Republic had better technology, and sure, the Death Star would have helped blow out a couple of world ships, but the Yuuzhan Vong would have taken care of it, and the New Republic used Star Destroyers, it used Super Star Destroyers, it used even more powerful ships like the Viscount and the Mediator, or rather the Mediator line. The actual Mediator was destroyed separately, but these were vessels created in the years directly preceding the war. One of my main concerns with the Empire is, although they don't have Borsk Failure at charge, they have arguably something worse, Emperor Palpatine. If I'm a strategist looking at the war, my main fear is that Emperor Palpatine sees the potential political opportunity offered by the Yuuzhan Vong as an excuse to fully militarize his force, and he makes the exact same mistakes as the New Republic, letting them get a foothold, letting them prowl basically untethered through the Outer Rim. Funny enough, the incredible cross-section for episode 3 even talks about the Empire using the threat of raging barbarians from outside the Outer Rim as a justification for further militarization, so I think Palpatine maybe again uses the Yuuzhan Vong. And he also is lacking his greatest faculty when it comes to the Vong, and that is the Force. The Yuuzhan Vong exist outside the Force, so it's going to be interesting to see how he responds. Other things worth noting is that the Empire would be less afraid to use certain techniques like bioweapons or even an outright campaign to eliminate the Vong as a species entirely, extermination, which the Jedi in particular were against, but I think for good reasons outside the moral ones. Yuuzhan Vong biology, for example, was very similar to that of many species in the Star Wars galaxy, especially humans. There's a very real possibility that Alpha Red, which was the anti-Vong bioweapon, could have jumped to humanity and it could have been game over. The Empire would have also certainly put less efforts into protecting refugees and ferrying survivors across the galaxy, but they ended up benefiting the New Republic, I think at least, ignoring the humanitarian point of view by the time the war was over. One major thing that the Empire lacks, however, that arguably shifted the war for the New Republic was the presence of Jedi. The Yuuzhan Vong pretty much immediately recognized Jedi as the greatest threat to their invasion, and they launched a campaign to try to turn the galaxy against its protectors, a campaign which was quite successful for a while. They also developed specific tools like the Voxyn, recognizing the Jedi threat again, and in the end it would be Jedi like Luke Skywalker, like Jaina Solo, like Anakin, and perhaps most relevantly, like Jason, who would turn the war and find a resolution which didn't see both sides grinding each other into the dust. So could the Empire have won? Yeah, but I don't think it's quite as cut and dry as some people suggest.
Today, I hope to cover the basics of Vong's starships, including the technology used and a few common starship types. Let's start with the basics. First off, every aspect of the Vong's technology was organic and custom grown for its specific purpose. There were negative and positive aspects to this. On the positive end, technology could be grown very quickly and custom created for a specific purpose. On the negative side, Vong technology could die or become sick. As an example, Vong armor was allergic to the Bafor tree native to Ithor and would swell up, becoming unusable if it came in contact with the tree's spores. The most unique and arguably important piece of Vong technology was the Dovin Basal. Dovin Basals had a variety of functions, most of which the New Republic struggled to counter. First off, they were typically one of the main sources of propulsion for small vessels, providing thrust, though larger ships would also use organic sails. The Dovin Basal was uniquely able to produce miniature black holes, which could obviously interact with gravity. Defensively, this was used to intercept incoming lasers or missiles, while offensively, it could, through nothing more than just proximity, rip the shields off nearby ships. However, the Dovin Basal having so many features was also somewhat of a downside, as the organ could be overwhelmed. For example, if a coral skipper was forced to generate gravity for a defensive purpose, it would lose propulsion and speed. The New Republic developed other countermeasures as well, even early on in the war. For example, strafing a vessel with fire could overwhelm the Dovin Basal, causing shots to get through. Dovin Basals on larger ships, or larger individual Dovin Basals, could also serve as interdictors or even weapons. The Vong created the Yogan core technique, which, as the citizens of Cernpadel discovered the hard way, uses a Dovin Basal to pull a moon or other stellar body onto a planet with obvious devastating effects. The commonality of these systems on large ships meant that almost every Yuuzhan Vong vessel of a significant size could serve as an interdictor. The main offensive tool of the Yuuzhan Vong, which often worked in cooperation with other technologies, was the Yaret core. The Yaret core fired rocks or other materials superheated to plasma at very high speeds. This led to the common nickname of Volcano Cannon or Plasma Cannon among the New Republic. Yaret core were extremely powerful, flexible, and difficult to counter. They came in various sizes and were custom grown for the specific class and size of starship, much like a turbo laser or laser cannon. When combined with the shield stripping effects of the Dovin Basal, our Yaret core could easily destroy a starfighter with a single shot. Next up we have the Yamosk and other smaller Vong brains. Yamosks were very powerful and often referred to as war coordinators. They were one of the most important aspects of Vong technology. They were involved with not only planning the overall Vong invasion, but also directly influencing the action of Vong warriors. At the Battle of Helska IV, Vong coral skippers were able to fight with incredible coordination due to the presence of a nearby Yamosk. Many ships also had their own smaller brains, which would help with navigation, including using hyperspace. The Vong took advantage of the psychic connection between living creatures known as Villips to facilitate instantaneous communication across distances. Villips could, and often were, placed on the bodies of Vong soldiers, much like a comlink, but could also be carried around or placed in starships. Like much of the Yuuzhan Vong's technology, they were fairly ghastly, inverting to show a representation of the collar. Many who encountered these creatures for the first time were fairly shook up. The Vong most often used Yorick coral as the hull of their ships. The coral, along with any other needed technologies, were grown and then melded together. Planets in the Star Wars galaxy, when conquered, were often adapted to grow Vong tech and equipment. But let's now look at a couple of the most common ship types. First is the Coral Skipper, the mainline Yuuzhan Vong starfighter. Now, I want to make this clear. Although these ships are organic, they are not self-piloting or sapient. They're still controlled by a Vong pilot. As a mid-sized ship, we have the Midroik, a Star Destroyer analog. This is first encountered by Rogue Squadron during the early weeks of the invasion. Midroik used numerous incredibly powerful Dovin Basals, allowing the ship to move quickly, pull ships closer, prevent the enemy from jumping to hyperspace, and defend from incoming weaponry, all at once. As a larger vessel, we have the Kor Chuk, including Shadow Shai's infamous Legacy of Torment. At 8 kilometers long, this ship was a dreadnought battle station transport hybrid, and took with it innumerable resources and warriors. Finally, we have the Vong WORLDSHIP, As with all technology, these vary drastically in size, with some world ships only 10, but many reaching 100 kilometers in diameter. They ferried much of Vong civilization between galaxies and were also formidable weapons in their own right. Given the opportunity, the New Republic would almost always dedicate resources to destroying a single Vong world ship.
Is there a difference between the Grisk and the Yuuzhan Vong? And by the way, regarding spelling, they're tough words, I get it, especially if you've only ever heard them in a YouTube video. So the Grisk first appeared in Thrawn Alliances, which was book 2 of the new canon Thrawn trilogy, and pretty much right from the introduction, people made comparisons between the Grisk and the Yuuzhan Vong. So, as a bit of summary, the Grisk are a warlike species which seem to operate nearly exclusively in the unknown regions. They are extremely mysterious. Their facial structure is actually somewhat similar to the common Yuuzhan Vong facial structure, with prominent brows often mentioned, although to be honest, the Yuuzhan Vong are essentially human in appearance, just slightly larger. Like the Yuuzhan Vong, the Grisk engage somewhat in ritual disfiguration, although rather than it being of their body, it was typically of their armor and weaponry. They also did some body modification, often adding hidden weapons, sometimes replacing their teeth. Honestly, I think a lot of the comparisons between the Yuuzhan Vong and the Grisk are because of the writing of Timothy Zahn. Timothy Zahn wrote The Outbound Flight, which has some of the first references to the Yuuzhan Vong. Well, chronologically, it came out after the series was released, but we see Thrawn communicating with Palpatine and he learns some vague details about the Yuuzhan Vong. And honestly, the way that Zahn would later write about the Grisk is somewhat similar in that they're a threat known to the unknown regions, but which could cause serious damage to the entire galaxy. I think part of the problem with the Grisk is that we never really see this threat manifested. We hear a lot about how dangerous the Grisk are to the galaxy, but I wouldn't say that's actualized. I'll come back to the Yuuzhan Vong in a second, but the Grisk to me are a lot closer to the Vagari. The Vagari are technically canon, although we know far more about them in Star Wars Legends. They're another long enemy of the Chiss. They're essentially a brutal race of nomadic pirates and slavers, just really nasty people. The Grisk are similar to that, albeit more powerful and better organized. I think they're also better run, and they also probably do have a secret base somewhere. But in terms of scale, the Grisk are a lot closer to the Vagari than they are the Yuuzhan Vong. And as a comparison point, let's look at what the Yuuzhan Vong were. The Yuuzhan Vong were an alien species from outside the galaxy. They basically saw the death of all life in their home galaxy, so they started a journey through intergalactic space, eventually finding the Star Wars galaxy, entering at a location called Vector Prime, and fighting a war which would last over 5 years. The Vong are an incredibly powerful fighting force. They took on the weight of the Star Wars galaxy and only barely lost, and their technology is also far different than the Grisk. The Grisk have somewhat diverging technology compared to the rest of the galaxy. The Yuuzhan Vong are totally alien. They rely on grown biological organisms for their starships, their armor, pretty much everything. And they have their own psychology based largely around the Yuuzhan Vong religious system. So no, the two factions aren't the same, and although Timothy Zahn positioned the Grisk as a potential major adversary in Star Wars canon, it's not a thread that anyone else has picked up on. Like, you look at the Grisk entry on the Star Wars wiki page, they've only been in Timothy Zahn Thrawn novels, nowhere else. That's one of the major differences between them and the Vong, just the scale of their threat and their positioning within the narrative structure. I think the similarities are really pretty surface level. The Yuuzhan Vong are a completely different thing, and I don't suspect we'll ever see the Yuuzhan Vong in Star Wars canon. It's funny because a few things related to the new Jedi Order have made their way in. It's funny, Zanoma Seacot, which is a planet very important to the Yuuzhan Vong War, has actually made its way into canon, for example, as have some other elements, but I think that's as far as things will go. Everyone knows that the Yuuzhan Vong were considered for an appearance in the Clone Wars. That never happened, and I'm not surprised that it never did. I think fan reaction to the Vong was always pretty mixed. You'll see this if you read the new Jedi Order. They come off as edgy for edgy's sake at times, the way they handle pain, and they're almost and I've said this before on my podcast, Tapcraft Transmissions, designed to be the antithesis to everything that people would consider warm and fuzzy in the galaxy. It's meant to represent their cultural differences, but it ends up being a bit corny at times. The Yuuzhan Vong also had a weird quirk around how they existed in the Force, which I'll probably talk about in a future video I've alluded to many times, and I don't think we'll see that again. The Star Wars canon has gone extragalactic with Peridia and Ahsoka, so I think the Yuuzhan Vong probably not going to make it.
So we're once again taking a look at the Yuuzhan Vong War, and specifically the first days of the invasion. I find this time period very, very interesting, as the New Republic and the galaxy were being attacked by an enemy that they figured couldn't possibly exist. They thought entry into the galaxy was impossible because of the Great Hyperspace Barrier. The Yuuzhan Vong also had very strange and new technology that the galaxy was no way prepared for. Vong Coral Skippers, their basic starfighters, used miniaturized black holes to not only absorb incoming blaster fire, but actually yank the shields off enemy ships. At Certain Padal, the Yuuzhan Vong also used a larger version of a Dovin Basil to pull the planet's moon to the surface in what was known as the devastating Yogon's core technique. This resulted in the death of all remaining on the planet, including, most famously, Chewbacca himself. Another really interesting element of the Yuuzhan Vong invasion was also the misdirection. The Yuuzhan Vong didn't simply attack the galaxy. Rather, they sent in advanced agents, including Nomenor, and later even an advanced fleet, the Praetorian Vong, in an effort to soften up the galaxy. By the way, before I continue, if this sounds interesting to you, and it should, this is awesome EU lore, we are currently going through the entire New Jedi Order, the Yuuzhan Vong book series, on my podcast, Tapcraft Transmissions. It's basically a book club. You can read along for a new book every couple of weeks, or you can just listen. A couple of Thursdays ago, we did Vector Prime, Book 1. This coming Thursday, we're doing Dark Tide 1, Book 2. It's definitely not too late to jump in. The episodes are very digestible. I'll link down below. But anyway, Vector Prime really focuses on two Yuuzhan Vong agents which were situated in the galaxy before the Vong world ships began arriving. One was Nomenor, the other was Yeoman Kar. Both of these individuals played a role in setting the galaxy up for the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, both in some really disturbing ways. Let's talk about Yeoman Kar first, because he is, well, the shorter lived of the two characters. Yeoman Kar infiltrated what was known as the Exgal Society. I talked about them in a recent video, but the Exgal Society's main purpose was to scan beyond the galactic rim for any evidence of life or information or whatever they could find, basically. Yeoman Kar disguised himself as human through a fairly disturbing creature known as an Oogolith masker. All Yuuzhan Vong use organic technology, and the masker essentially inserted itself into your skin, including over your face, making you look like a human or any other creature, really. Additionally, Yeoman Kar used another small biotic known as a teasel worm, which burrowed into his ear and translated basic so that he could understand when people were talking to him. Kar spent several months among the Exgal scientists on the planet Belkadan, where there was a small outpost. He had two roles here. For one, he was using the equipment to observe extragalactic space so that he could see the fleet approaching Vector Prime, their entry point into the galaxy, and two, once the fleet was spotted, he was to eliminate everyone on Belkadan so that the rest of the galaxy would not be notified, and also prepare the planet for further use. Kar utilized a disturbing and incredibly dangerous creature known as a dweebit. Upon arriving at the planet, Kar released several of these small beetles, which began dominating the Belkadan ecosystem. The Vong had several ways to destroy or at least eliminate all hostile life on planets, and the dweebits were one. The moment where the fleets of the Praetorian Vong are discovered is an interesting one in Vector Prime. As we discussed on the podcast, the novel at that point almost turns into a horror story. We first see a group of scientists who are leaving the planet notice a massive storm, which seems to be approaching quite rapidly the Exgal base. They try to communicate with the surface, but Kar has destroyed all equipment planetside. Unfortunately, they can't turn around, and we see, from Kar's perspective, as without a masker now in his disfigured Yuuzhan Vong form, he begins assassinating quite brutally the members of the Exgal team. In the meantime, some of the survivors are trying to figure out what's going on. They try to scout out the storm, and they discover that something very strange is going on. The storm, in fact, is made up of fumes, which almost immediately chokes and kills anyone who goes within it.
We see the scientists trying to run back to the Excal station. They're basically picked off one by one from the storm as they run out of oxygen, and in the end it's revealed that it's not volcanic activity or some weird natural phenomenon on the planet, rather it's the bugs, the dweebits introduced by Carr, which have been reproducing and which are now through some means excreting these toxic fumes. Eventually the fumes will be such that they'll cover the entire planet. Carr will only survive through the use of Yuuzhan Vong technology, but essentially the planet is doomed. Not just to humans, but also most natural life as well. Mara Jade and Luke would travel to Belkadan investigating what would happen, and they would end up fighting and killing the rogue Vong agent, but there would be nothing they could do to save the planet. Luke and Jason would return about a month later and would find Belkadan serving as a ship womb for Yuuzhan Vong vessels. Another, more relevant agent of the early Yuuzhan Vong attack was Nom Anor. Nom Anor had actually been within the galaxy for perhaps decades, and his actions were arguably more elegant and also destructive than Yeoman Carr. Instead of trying to fade into the background as Carr did, Nom Anor instead sought to find positions of power and use them to stoke rivalries between existing nations or planets. The most famous example of this would be Osarian and MAUL. On MAUL, Nor essentially worked his way into a leadership position where he stoked existing tensions between the two planets and at every turn made sure that the war continued to escalate. The two planets weren't very advanced technologically, but they had an orbit which for a short period of time brought them close together. During one of these periods, Nom Anor launched a nuclear strike against Osarian, which then retaliated against MAUL, causing full-fledged nuclear war. Nom Anor was presumed dead when a nuclear-laden shuttle launched a suicide attack against the Mediator, a powerful New Republic capital ship, but of course he managed to escape. Nom Anor was also known for secretly infecting many within the New Republic with a mysterious illness which had almost a 100% fatality rate. This was in fact the Yuuzhan Vong biotic, the Coom spore, funny name I know, which itself seemed to be perhaps a cousin or relative at least of the dweebit. As I said, everyone infected with the Coom spore died and usually died pretty quickly, with the one exception of Mara Jade, who used the Force to hold off its effects. After leaving MAUL and Osarian, Nom Anor would move on to the rest of the galaxy to look for weak points which he could strike in order to weaken and soften up the galaxy for a potential Yuuzhan Vong invasion. A lot of today's content, most of it in fact, actually comes from the novel Jedi Eclipse. One of the really high points in this book for me, despite how dark and disturbing it is that we see what the Yuuzhan Vong invasion is like from the perspective of refugees who are simply trying to survive. One of the most interesting things about the Yuuzhan Vong is that, unlike, say, the Empire, their strategies aren't predictable and often aren't dictated by military sense or logic. Instead, the early stages of the Yuuzhan Vong War especially saw the Vong motivated to, above all else, really cause fear for those within the Star Wars galaxy. I guess in a way that's not dissimilar to the Empire and, say, the Tarkin Doctrine, but the Vong take it to the next level. For example, going back to Jedi Eclipse, early on in that book, we learn that the Vong's attack strategy has been specifically designed to try to hunt down refugees and survivors from fallen worlds. That's part of the reason why trying to be on the run from the invaders would be so terrifying. You know that if they're at a planet, it's probably not for a tactical advantage. They're not going to simply occupy the capital city and let the survivors do what they will. No, they're first going to want to Vong form the planet, which is basically them terraforming it to suit their needs. Then they're going to want to abduct people and either bring them to a sacred place for sacrifices or put them through horrible torture in order to try to make them see the light of the Vong religion. Another terrifying aspect of the early Yuuzhan Vong War was the fact that the New Republic was so heavily outgunned. The New Republic was also dedicated to protecting, above all else, certain key planets in the core, like Kuat or Bothui, to the point where they were more than willing to sacrifice other worlds rather than to move their fleets out of place. Now, things get a little bit better, especially when they begin coordinating more directly with other factions like the Empire and the Hapens, but the planet Jindine, for example, is essentially left to try to fend for itself, and obviously that's not possible. That means that the New Republic was willing to let billions and billions of people die in order to protect trillions. So we have essentially a hyper-aggressive enemy, which the New Republic cannot stop everywhere, an enemy which is hunting down refugees and innocents. But to make things worse, the technology and the tactics of the Vong were also terrible. Everyone knows Padal. In that case, the Yuuzhan Vong used a Dovin Basil, essentially a gravity manipulating biot, to pull Padal's moon into its surface, causing, well, apocalyptic damage. And while that was obviously an overt action, the Yuuzhan Vong were able to accomplish a lot of this through subterfuge. Early on in the war, pretty much every major attack by the Yuuzhan Vong had integrated agents among the civilians. They would do everything from espionage and information passing to the Vong to trying to start riots to more overt actions like attempted assassinations. The Vong actually had unique technology which allowed them to camouflage themselves, but I think their biots, which was their word for their living technology, also brought out a primal fear in a lot of beings. Most of their technologies are invasive, they have no regard for pain, as the Yuuzhan Vong revere pain, and they're just disturbing and frightening on, I think, a fundamental level. The Battle of Jindin saw one of the Yuuzhan Vong's most terrifying creatures in my opinion, and for this I'm just going to read directly from the book. Parading out of sunrise like the harbingers of a new and dreadful dawn came a legion of enormous bladder-like creatures supported on 6 stubbly legs and equipped with arrays of flexible proboscises from which gust streams of gelatinous flame. Yet another example of the Empire's genetically engineered monstrosities. The 30-meter tall fire breathers didn't so much as march as loll over the terrain like loosely tethered lighter than air balloons, incinerating everyone and everything in their path. These beasts, by the way, were not only dangerous flame-throwing monstrosities, but also emitted an aerosol which drastically affected the potency of the New Republic's lasers. Other terrifying enemies include the Dreadworm, which could chew through space stations and consume people as whole, either for food or as prisoners, or one of my favorite, the Voxyn, the Jedi Hunters, which I've actually detailed in a prior video, I'll link up above. If you read the Battle of Jindin, I really think you get a good idea of what the beginning and mid stages of the war was like. There's just not enough ships to save everyone who needs to be saved. Leia's trying to help save as many refugees as she can. Babies are being passed to people who can make it on board, and it really ends with the small flotilla of refugee ships flying away from the planet as the shipyards explode and fall to the surface. Just a really, really impactful moment in my opinion.
From space slugs to the always bigger fish to whatever this thing is, there's absolutely no shortage of deadly creatures in the Star Wars galaxy. However, it would be the extragalactic Yuuzhan Vong who would create perhaps the deadliest species ever seen. Certainly, as we'll discuss today, the species that Jedi feared the most. So, a bit of history. As the Vong invaded and crushed formal New Republic resistance in the galaxy, the only faction that really won battles consistently against the invaders were the Jedi. At the Battle of Ithor, one of the Praetorian Vong's greatest warriors, Shadow Shai, was slain by Corran Horn. And the Praetorian Vong itself, which was an advanced scouting force, had also been decimated by Jedi-led resistance at the Battle of Helska IV. And that was only the beginning. Once the full fleet arrived, the Jedi scored several crucial victories, and in response, the Vong came up with a bunch of solutions. They infiltrated the New Republic and helped push forward anti-Jedi policy, they targeted Jedi specifically during battle, and they released an edict attempting to turn the galaxy against their greatest protectors. However, none of these really slowed the Jedi down, so the Vong turned to what they did best: creating weapons. Enter the Voxyn, a terrifying creature made of the combined genes of the extragalactic Pharazin and the Vornskr, both deadly creatures in their own right. Voxyn first appear in Star by Star, Book 10 of the New Jedi Order. They're described as, and I quote, "not higher than a human waist, but more than 4 meters long, with a flattish head and an undulating body covered in black scales. A line of coarse, sensory bristles ran down its spine, and a white barb protruded from its flickering whip of a tail." In that book, the Voxyn appear first on a ship which is secretly harboring Jedi. I'll get to their specific feats later, but there is a quote that I'd like to read for you guys. As Almina neared her sister, the creature swung its broad snout in her direction and sprayed a jet of brown saliva through the hatchway. Prepared by the attack on her sister, she opened herself to the Force, and with an almost unconscious wave of her fingertips, sent the stream washing back towards her attacker. The Voxyn, fast as a blaster bolt, closed its eyes and turned away before the mucus struck. struck, Almina hardly cared. She grabbed her sister beneath the arms, smearing her own fingers in the burning mucus, and tried not to think about what the stuff was doing to Numa's face and eyes. Almina cried out and started to look down, then felt the mucus burning into the bones of her fingertips. The Voxyn's snout turned towards her and opened half a meter. A deafening shriek filled her ears, then the fist of a powerful compression wave slammed her in the stomach. She suddenly felt dizzy and sick, and in the next second, she was slumped against the escape pod, cradling her sister's dead body in her arms. The Voxyn are, to put it lightly, not pleasant, and this is one of the most unpleasant scenes in the new Jedi Order. Sisters Almina and Nuna are set upon by one of these beasts, with the latter killed. Almina also loses half of her hand just by accidentally touching some of the Voxyn's spit. But with the stage set, let's now talk about some history. From core worlds like Kuat, to escorts on Yuuzhan Vong ships, to frontline battlefields, Voxyns were specifically bred and trained as Jedi hunters. The training took place on Vong ships, which acclimated the beasts to the numerous environments they could expect to encounter Jedi. These creatures learned, and they were very intelligent. We see in Star by Star that a Voxyn is able to understand a turbolift and manipulate its controls. They were more than capable of listening to Yuuzhan Vong commands, likely due to the fact that they were half VORN'S, which were basically large dogs. However, the training is only the tip of the iceberg. Voxyns were truly deadly because of their biological gifts. First of all, they had the unique ability to track Jedi through the Force, and upon detecting a Force signature, would hunt it relentlessly. Even techniques like going small in the Force and hiding your presence were relatively unsuccessful against the species. Their range was also incredible. As the Jedi surprise attacked the Vong at the Battle of Ebok, Voxyn on the bridge of various command ships began to screech wildly. What's more, they could also counteract a Jedi's own Force sensing abilities and were able to minimize their own presence, and of course would do so when hunting Force sensitives. However, even from a conventional sense, Voxyn were just incredibly gifted. As illustrated in the above quote, they possessed a spit which could easily melt through organics, killing them. Even something like an accidental splash to the legs or arms would be more than enough to incapacitate a victim. They also possessed fangs and claws, which were augmented with poison, and a tail, which was known to cut victims apart. Alongside that was their screech, which operated somewhat like a force push, disorienting and hurting a victim while also destroying their eardrums. And even upon death, Voxyn released noxious blood, which would cause those in the vicinity to become violently ill. On a defensive side, they were incredibly resilient. Famed Jedi healer Silgal could find no weakness in the species. During the raid on Merkur, some were unfazed by lightsaber strikes, or blaster attacks, or even being too close to explosions from thermal detonators. While hunting Jedi in their first canon appearance, one also survives being crushed under a bulkhead. They could lose limbs, and were even known to rip off their own body parts if stuck during the hunt. But don't forget, they were also very, very fast, able to keep up with a Jedi in combat. The Queen whirled away from the silver ball, found her handler in the way, and slapped him aside. Jacen saw an arm fly in one direction and the rest of the Shaper tumble in another. Then the Voxyn was racing towards him, head rising to belch acid. She disgorged her acid at 3 paces. Jacen launched into an airborne roundoff and the brown spray shot below. Then the detonator crackled behind him and he found himself swinging at empty air. He landed lightly and sprang into a half twist that brought him around facing the same direction as before. And his heart rose into his throat. No Voxyn. This species, as I've illustrated, was so deadly that the Jedi Order feared that they would actually drive them to extinction. One of the only times you see Jedi scared during the Yuuzhan Vong War, even when fighting an already terrifying invader, is feeling the presence of a Voxyn somewhere nearby, hunting them down. However, the Voxyn also had a weakness. There was only one hybrid, and the individual creatures were not able to reproduce. All Voxyns were based off this one queen and would actually quickly deteriorate after time. The removal of Voxyns from the galaxy was so important that Han Solo and Luke Skywalker accepted a plan which would see all the Solo children, as well as many other young Jedi Knights, sent on a suicide mission. The Voxyn Queen and cloning samples would successfully be destroyed, though Anakin Solo would be killed in the process, with Jacen taken captive. The remaining Voxyn would slowly die out, either through direct combat or deterioration.
Because we're diving deep into Star Wars Legends to discuss one of my favorite characters, Anakin Solo. And no, not Anakin Skywalker, not Ben Solo, Anakin Solo, the youngest child of Han and Leia in Star Wars Legends. I wanted to address this because of a question we got from Buckwild, who says, how much latent force potential did Anakin Solo have? Just a reminder, by the way, submit your own questions. Include the hashtag AskAk so I can find them. So Anakin Solo's a really interesting character. He's less well known than his siblings, and I think that's for several reasons. For one, spoiler alert, Anakin dies halfway through the new Jedi Order. He's just 16, so we don't see a lot of his potential. Although certainly at the time of his death, as we'll get to, he arguably nonetheless reaches his ultimate power. Really though, Anakin Solo dying in Star by Star means he's not in the rest of the new Jedi Order, obviously, with Jaina and Jacen squarely becoming two arguably the two most important characters in the series. Jaina and Jacen then figure very prominently in the subsequent novels and series, including The Dark Nest Crisis, Legacy of the Force, where Jaina ends up killing Jacen, and for Jaina, Fate of the Jedi. A lot of people went into the New Jedi Order less familiar with Anakin as well. Jaina and Jacen as the twins got more attention, probably because they were born in the Thrawn trilogy, whereas Anakin was introduced in Dark Empire. Jaina and Jacen are also older, so with the exception of the Corellian trilogy, they're more prominent in the early Bantam works, and the Young Jedi Knights series was how a lot of young readers, including myself, were first introduced to Star Wars Legends, and that features Jaina, Jacen, and their friends training at Luke's Jedi Praxium, whereas Anakin had his own series, Junior Jedi Knights, which was less popular and geared towards even younger readers. So really, Jaina and Jacen are sort of the face of the next generation of Jedi within Luke's Jedi Order, with Anakin being a little bit, but not much younger. However, pretty much immediately, Anakin was the dramatic heart of the early new Jedi Order. He fights alongside his brother and sister in the early battles of the war. He's also not only present for the death of Chewbacca, but Chewbacca dies helping to save his life. Han ends up going into a deep depression, blaming Anakin and fracturing the relationship between the two, which is made more tragic by Anakin's subsequent death, especially because he'd begun to fall in love with the character Tahiri, who in her own way is also a very tragic character. The new Jedi Order sees basically all of the Solo children grow up and take the next steps in their journey. For Jacen, it's a philosophical one. For Jaina, she's trying to figure out her role in the galaxy. For Anakin, it's different. Anakin Solo, especially after his death, is almost always described as the single most latently powerful Force user of, if not just the Skywalker family, perhaps all time. I've got to give credit to the Comic Vine article created by The Vivus, which did a great job of collecting a bunch of these quotes. I recently reread through the new Jedi Order for my podcast, Tapcaf Transmission, so I had a lot of them floating around, but 19 books long. Anakin, however, is much like his namesake in that pretty much all of his Force abilities come natural and without work. He's unlike Jacen, who is inward and kind of unsure. Anakin just has it, and that's also part of the reason why he was killed. Anakin was definitely being set up as the next chosen one, and it's long been said that it was George Lucas who said he had to go, and having two characters named Anakin filling sort of the same role at the same time the prequels were releasing, I get where he was coming from. Anyway, I was very happy to crack the new Essential Guide to Characters before starting to record this video because it makes it pretty easy. It says outright, Anakin's connection to the Force seemed primal, much more profound than either of his siblings. This talent was recognized by his enemies. His parents and his uncle Luke recognized Anakin's status as a nexus of the Force. Keep in mind, we're talking about Jacen Solo. Jacen Solo, who becomes one with the Force to essentially end the Yuuzhan Vong War. Anakin Solo has a more primal, profound connection to the Force than Jacen or Jaina, Sword of the Jedi. That Comic Vine Respect thread I referenced earlier also had a really nice quote from the Star Wars Encyclopedia I was not aware of. Born 6 years after the death of his grandfather, Anakin Solo was the youngest of Han Solo and Princess Leia Organa Solo's 3 children, and the strongest in the Force. You could argue that the Solo children were on a different class than the elder Anakin or Luke, and I'd be open to hearing that, but I think that's sort of of like over video gaming the way the Force works in Star Wars. I think it picks people. I think it's about destiny, and I see Anakin Solo as on that same level. And that's really how the New Jedi Order talks about him as well after his death. And what Anakin could have become is a very, very interesting question. It's one Jason often thinks about in the New Jedi Order after his brother's death. Even before that, in Edge of Victory Rebirth, Corran Horn says, "You may not know it, but of all the younger Jedi and a lot of the older ones look up to you. The buzz is you're the next Luke Skywalker, at the very least." Anyway, his status among Jedi of his generation, at least, is certainly solidified in Star by Star. Anakin Solo is picked to lead the strike to Mercure. For those who haven't read the novel, the Yuuzhan Vong develop a terrible biot known as a Voxyn. It's a mix between a Vornsker and a Zin. I've done an entire video on it. Two animals basically bred together to make a creature which is incredibly dangerous and which kills Jedi unlike any other, in really terrible ways as well. The beginning of Star by Star features the death of Ali Marar's sister. It's awful. Anyway, the Jedi organize a mission to the world ship Banu Ross, and Anakin Solo is chosen as team leader. This is alongside his brother and sister, many other talented Jedi. And without going into too much detail, it ends essentially with Anakin Solo sacrificing himself so the other members of his team can escape, and so that he can kill the stored DNA of the Voxyn and their queen. Anakin already had a special role within the Yuuzhan Vong War. He had a sort of Vong sense. The Yuuzhan Vong ordinarily couldn't be sensed through the Force. Anakin developed a means to do so with the help of a lambent Vong crystal. It's hard to explain. But on Banu Ross, being overwhelmed by hordes of Yuuzhan Vong, Anakin does the incredible. As he's vomiting blood, literally using the Force to lift his body and keep going on after being stabbed countless times, he faces off against 40 Yuuzhan Vong warriors. Anakin opened himself to the Force completely, drawing it into himself through the power of his emotions, not through his anger or fear like a dark Jedi, but through his love for his family and his fellow Jedi Knight. The Force poured in from all sides, filling him with a swirling maelstrom of power and purpose, saturating him and devouring him. There was nothing to be frightened of, no purpose to grieve. He could feel it flowing into himself and himself flowing into it. Anakin was the Force, and the Force was Anakin. He rose, his body emitting a faint aura of light, the glow of his cells burning out, and the air crackled around him. His injuries no longer pained him. He was acutely aware of everything, even the Yuuzhan Vong. Their presence was as distinct to him as that of his own companions. Anakin ends up killing most of the Vong through pure Force energy, to the point where his body essentially dies and becomes an avatar for the Force swirling through him. His aura was burning so brightly that he cast shadows behind his foes. He batted the blade left to right, overpowering 2 blocks to open 2 throats, then sent another warrior tumbling with a hook kick to the head. Anakin's death is described as him melting back into the Force, and he succeeds in not only saving his friends and family, but destroying the Voxyn and the samples of DNA, essentially ending the threat. So yes, Anakin had incredible potential. You can argue specifics. Oh, Jason had more, Luke had more, Anakin Skywalker had more. To me, he is the Jedi who's the biggest what if, and I truly believe he could have been the most powerful of all time.
Anyway, as I stated, all of these stories are from Vector Prime and represent the New Republic's initial resistance to the Praetorite Vong, who were basically the scouts of the full invasion. Aside from the machinations of Nam Anor, who had been within the Star Wars galaxy and stirring up trouble for some time, the Yuuzhan Vong Invasion was kicked off by the disabling of Exgal 4. Exgal was an organization which searched for extragalactic life, and Exgal 4 was a listening post on the planet Belkaden. Among the Exgal researchers was an undercover Yuuzhan Vong agent known as Yeoman Kar. The Vong entered the galaxy through the Tingle Arm, and specifically a point known as Vector Prime. As the first world ship approached, Yeoman Kar attempted to hide it from Exgal researchers, and when it was discovered, he downplayed its significance. The first world ship landed on the 4th planet of the Helska system. Of course, curious to what this might be, the Exgal team leaves their planet and goes to investigate. However, by the time they arrive, the world ship had already begun begun offloading smaller vessels, and the Excal force is shot down and captured. However, the action near the planet alerts the Dozen and Two Avengers, a starfighter squad led by Kip Duron, which had been fighting pirates and smugglers in the Outer Rim. What follows is the first formal military engagement between the Vong and the New Republic. As the 14 ships emerge from hyperspace, they spot what appears to be an asteroid field. Kip flies away from the squadron and goes to investigate. However, several things tell him that something's not right. First of all, though the objects are shaped like asteroids, they are quite visually distinctive, and they don't appear on any maps or records. Soon, a wave of fighters is launched and Kip is forced to return to the squadron. At first, things seem okay. The Yuuzhan Vong ships are extremely sturdy, but unable to pierce the shields of the New Republic fighters. However, many of the pilots then describe individual strong tugs of gravity, pulling the shields off their fighters. Without shields, they're destroyed very quickly. What's more, these Dovin basils, which manipulate gravity, also work against New Republic torpedoes, catching them and harmlessly crushing them. Eventually, with their force whittled down to just Kip and a couple of other pilots, the Dozen and Two Avengers is forced to retreat. The New Republic ships are faster than the Coral Skippers, however, the Yuuzhan Vong let loose insect-like creatures, which managed to destroy all but Duron, who is the only member of the squadron to escape. By this point, the second and third Yuuzhan Vong world ships are near the galaxy. As a first strike against the New Republic, the Vong target Cernpadel, another planet in the Dolobian sector of the Tingle Arm. A Dovin basil is placed on the planet's surface, which creates a very powerful gravity field. This pulls Cernpadel's moon onto the planet in a devastating tactic known as the Yogant Core. Han and Anakin Solo, who had been planetside running a job for Lando, are able to mobilize civilian ships, affecting the evacuation of over 20,000 individuals. But even with Anakin's discovery of the Dovin basil, the catastrophe cannot be prevented and millions, including Chewbacca, are killed. Nearby, Luke and Mara are investigating Belkadin and the Excal 4 research facility. Mara fights with and kills Yeoman Kar, though struggles due to both the illness she's been facing and the effectiveness of Vong armor and weaponry. The survivors of Cernpadel, as well as Kip Duron, who had been picked up by Han, regroup at Dubrillion, where Lando has set up a mining operation on a nearby asteroid belt. Unfortunately, they had been chased by Vong forces, and the Yamosk, the Yuuzhan Vong's organic war brain, has ordered a full attack. Although a Star Destroyer is on its way to Dubrillion, it will not be there in time to protect against this first wave. The New Republic thus fields the Falcon, piloted by Han and gunned by Leia and Kip Duron, the 3 Solo children in TIE X-1s, as well as several other ships. The 3 children remain close to the planetary surface because Lando has technology which can provide them with a shield. They manage to fight off most of the Vong ships which come their way, however the city and the fighters protecting it take some serious losses. Things are worse in space. The Dovin basils of the Vong continue to pull shields off New Republic fighters, and all, including the Falcon, are on their heels. Eventually the Solo children leave atmosphere and bring their fight to space. As the remaining New Republic starfighters pull back to the planet, decimated, the Solo children lead the Vong fighters into Lando's Folly, the nearby asteroid belt. In an epic moment, they link together their minds with the Force, dominating the Yuuzhan Vong Coral Skippers using asteroids and their unique connection, making 3 starfighters essentially one. However, this eventually overwhelms Anakin and he's forced to hyperspace jump out of the asteroid field, although he is successfully recovered by his parents. The Yuuzhan Vong fighters here are all eventually defeated or forced to retreat, and Dubrillion is saved. The next major battle would be a New Republic offensive at Helska 4. After a devastating first assault, the Yuuzhan Vong have killed millions and established a base on the 4th planet of the Helka system. Their first world ship, the vanguard of the Vong force, had landed on Helska 4 and was exerting serious pressure on the rest of the sector, with the very real threat of allowing the Praetorian Vong to rampage throughout the galaxy. Finally, the first element of New Republic reinforcements arrive, the Star Destroyer Rejuvenator, under the control of Commander Warshak Rojo and a small support fleet. The immediate goal is the rout of the Yuuzhan Vong and the removal of their foothold in the galaxy. The fleet has 2 options. Reinforcements are on the way, specifically a second Star Destroyer, 3 battle cruisers, and an escort fleet, but they won't reach the system for 6 days, so they can wait or they can attack Helska directly. Rojo chooses the latter, and our heroes, as well as some space-worthy civilian vessels, depart from Dubrillion. A few moments earlier, Jason and Jaina had hijacked a vessel and were on their way to the planet themselves. They reach Helska Helska 4 before the fleet, and Jacen is launched to the surface in a unique ice-boring vessel. As he approaches, he uses his thrusters, alerting the Yuuzhan Vong to Jaina, who was still in the shuttle that transported the two. As she's chased by the Yuuzhan Vong, the New Republic fleet emerges over the planet, quickly suppressing the nearby coral skippers. On the surface, Jacen is attempting to rescue Yuuzhan Vong captives. The battle rages on in space, with the New Republic having a marked advantage over Vong forces. In reality, however, this is all a ruse. The Yamosk war coordinator of the Vong had sacrificed this first line of defense in order to draw the opposing fleet in towards the planet. Once their prey is close enough, thousands of Yuuzhan Vong coral skippers are launched from the planet-side world ship. For a while, the New Republic's brand new Ranger gunships are able to hold the fighters off, but they're soon overwhelmed by both the Vong Dovin basal technology and the degree to which the opposing force is fighting in almost absolute synchronicity. Overwhelmed, the Rejuvenator Star Destroyer decides to go for an all-or-nothing assault on the planet. Knowing that Jacen is still there, Luke and the Falcon follow. However, the Star Destroyer is soon destroyed, overwhelmed by ground-based cannons and tractor beams. Kip, who had been leading the starfighters in space, calls for retreat, an order echoed by Luke. And with an incredible bit of flying, Jaina is able to strafe the surface of the planet, pick up her brother as well as the prisoner he recovered, and jump to hyperspace, all in just a matter of seconds. Regrouping, the New Republic comes up with another plan. They recognize the coordinating effects of the Yamosk and the fact that it outputs a ton of energy. However, the problem with killing the biological war coordinator is that it's protected by hundreds of Vong warriors, buried deep underground, it itself is powerful, and of course, it's still coordinating Vong pilots. Anakin, however, has a solution. It's fairly complicated, and to be honest, I don't think it makes a shred of scientific sense, but basically, Helska 4 is an ice ball. Anakin's plan is to cool the planet by causing a massive evaporation through an influx of energy. Again, I don't think it makes any sense, but that's his plan. Back in the Thrawn trilogy, Lando has a project near the planet Niklon. In order to approach the planet, which was extremely close to a star, you had to use a shield ship, something that redirected energy. Thankfully, Lando has saved several of these ships and actually has them docked near Destrillion. He summons them immediately. The fleet, which is down to these 6 ships as well as several fighters and civilian vessels, makes a coordinated jump back to Helska 4. They jump in an extremely tight formation and very close to the planet, so much so that the hyperspace jump itself actually causes several fatalities. The 6 shield ships move into position and almost immediately feel the effects of the war coordinator, the energy it's generating. They begin sending this back towards the planet. All other ships move in a defensive position around the cruisers. Luke, channeling all the power available to him, dives towards the planet in his X-Wing, bringing with him dozens of fighters. As this is happening, the Yamosk actually realizes that the shield ships are meant to counter its effect, but thinks they're only attempting to stop communications between ships, not actually divert the energy. The shield ships are, however, quickly destroyed. However, with only 2 left, the New Republic's scientifically questionable plan eventually works out, and a domino effect begins. In what Anakin calls a Mesocanley wave, the planet blows up because of science, thus killing all Vong on the surface and destroying the first Yuuzhan Vong world ship. Quite an interesting and certainly strange battle, and definitely a unique way to destroy a planet. When the topic of battle droids or battle droid armies comes up, most people, when talking about Star Wars, think of the Confederacy of Independent Systems and their many trillions of droids fielded during the Clone Wars. While that army was good, it never quite dominated, and the droids didn't push the army to the next level, unlike the creations we're about to discuss. Zim the Despot was one of the greatest warlords in galactic history, creating an empire over 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Zim brutally violated, sacked, and conquered worlds across the galaxy, acquiring unimaginable wealth. During his war against the Hutts, Zim's military, however, took on a bold new form, an army of special troopers made up of gigantic 3-meter tall war robots. Although incredibly ancient by modern standards, Zim's droids were powered by an even more ancient force, the Rakata. Allegedly, the most advanced models of Zim's droids were augmented by Force-imbued technologies. far increasing their capabilities and allowing them to devastate enemies with their thick armor, heat beams, particle weapons, and pulse wave blasters. However, even standard droids use reverse engineered Rakatan technology, and this gave them several edges. The key one was probably intelligence. Although again, the droids were ancient by modern Star Wars standards and lacked the true intelligence of something like C-3PO or even a super battle droid, the Essential Guide to Warfare states that, unlike prior droid models, they had at the very least a glimmer of intelligence. That being said, during battle, they very rigidly and literally interpreted their orders, which were usually dispensed remotely by an organic commander. Still, the extra intelligence would have made the droids just overall more effective workers. Zim's war droids were very large and bulky. Though they were quite difficult to destroy, they were also very slow, heavily armored almost everywhere. These aren't like armored humanoid soldiers, they're more like walking tanks. Unfortunately, well, not really for the rest of the Star Wars universe, but for the army at least, Zim was captured and eventually died under the Hutts. Many of his droids afterwards, which were produced on a much more limited run than later droid armies, were then destroyed by the Hutts at the Third Battle of Fondor. With Zim dead and no more droids being actively produced, the Essential Guide to Warfare explains that the remaining units were handed down among ancient families as bodyguards, while others were stationed on long-lost outposts of the Despot's empire. At least 2 of these hidden caches saw action during the modern Star Wars era. During the early Galactic Civil War, 1,000 of Zim's robots, a brigade known as the Guardian Corps, was accidentally activated, destroying the miners on the planet Dalat, as we see in Han Solo and The Lost Legacy, though most of those were eventually destroyed when a bridge collapsed under their weight. Despite being over 25,000 years old and unused for almost that entire time, the war droids operated perfectly, showing no signs of aging, speaking to the quality of their creation as well as the incredible and mysterious Rakatan technology that helped to power them. Another group of droids had, well, a bit more fun of a final stand. The Hutts seized some of Zim's remaining droids after the Battle of Fondor and brought them back to their home space. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, as the Vong betrayed the Hutts, who had been working with them prior to that, and moved into Hutt territory, many of Zim's droids were reactivated and managed to kill thousands of Vong warriors before being destroyed. This is not unlike the squadron of B2s who also fought the Vong in a video which I'll link above. Again, that's 25,000 years of biding their time, and they still devastated Vong warriors, which were nearly unequaled in strength and combat skill. This also makes me wonder how Zim's droids would have done against Lando's YVHs. YVHs probably had better armor and tactics, just given to the time of their design, but Zim's droids probably make up for some of that by being much larger. I think overall the YVHs would probably be better against single high skill opponents or in tight spaces like starships, but that Zim's droids would still have their uses as well, especially in large battles. When I say battle droid, your mind probably goes to the bumbling and incompetent B1s of the Clone Wars and beyond, or maybe the slightly more dangerous B2s or even B3s. However, Star Wars Legends has within it a battle droid that should strike fear into your heart, as it did the enemies of the New Republic and later Galactic Alliance, a veritable Terminator, a tool of absolute destruction. For much of Star Wars Legends, the Yuuzhan Vong Hunter line of battle droids, the YVHs, were heroic. They fought alongside Jedi and slaughtered the technophobic Yuuzhan Vong by the hundreds, tearing apart the invaders with pulse rifles, metallic fists, and grenades, all with maximum efficiency. YVHs stood strong against the Killiks, crushing bugs in the cramped corridors of their own nest ships, helping the Galactic Alliance to destroy the Darkness and prevent a galaxy-engulfing war. However, some 40 years after the Battle of Yavin, as systems rebelled against an increasingly authoritarian government, Jacen Solo deposed Chief of State Cal Omis, seizing control of the GA and ruling the galaxy through a military junta. As Jacen fell deeper to the dark side, many of history's greatest heroes were now marked as enemies, including not only the Jedi, but his own family. While Mon Calamari cruisers bombed planets like Kashyyyk alongside Star Destroyers, Jacen Solo was guarded by his cadre of YVH droids. On one particular trip to Coruscant, he was guarded by a single YVH, and during this encounter, we learn of the machine's deadliness. From Legacy of the Force Fury, we get the following. There's other bad news. The second vehicle is carrying a YVH combat droid. The Yuuzhan Vong Hunter droids, designed at the height of the Yuuzhan Vong War, were formidable. In a one-on-one match between a Jedi Knight and a YVH droid, the odds were about even. If the Jedi was experienced, if the battle dragged on long enough for her to tire, she was likely to be the loser, a dead loser. Later, as Grand Master Luke Skywalker and a Jedi strike team including Sabah Sebatine hunted Jacen on his own Star Destroyer, Jacen anticipated that his 8 protective droids would be enough to whittle down the Jedi numbers. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's examine the history of the YVH. The Yuuzhan Vong invaded in 25 ABY, killing trillions in their opening Outer Rim blitzes. The average Vong warrior could match a Jedi in combat and would devastate lesser skilled opponents. In response, Tendrando Arms, a corporation founded by Lando and his wife Tendra Regent, produced the first batch of YVH battle droids. These were terrifying tools of war, and were designed to be. YVHs were engineered specifically to drive Yuuzhan Vong warriors into a maddened frenzy during battle. Their appearance was modeled after the aliens, who saw technology as sacrilegious, and bellowed an array of insults in an edited, hyper-masculinized version of Lando's voice. But I'll let Calrissian himself sell you on the droid. We get the following, paraphrased from Star by Star. The YVH is a top-notch war droid with flawless search and identify engineering, the heavy weapons punch of a 4-seater blast car, and with the optional aluminium layered armor, the durability to survive even the most hazardous postings. The hulking war droid sprang into view, a skull-headed blur of black and gray camouflage, bouncing across the floor in a dizzying array of evasive flips and mid-air twists. It crashed through a ferrocrete wall that had apparently been erected just for that purpose, dived over a hovering land speeder, and finished by positioning itself precisely at the entrance of the proving facility. The droids had repulsors built into their legs, which allowed them to jump massive heights. They had blasters, powerful enough to destroy a coral skipper, a powerful Vong starfighter, sensors which could identify even the most well-cloaked enemies at a glance, and self-healing armor. Even a demonstration model YVH with artificially limited firepower killed several Yuuzhan Vong during a raid, crushing one like an egg, liquefying the warrior within his own armor. Soon after their introduction into the New Republic military, YVHs were instrumental during the Jedi suicide mission to Merkur, destroying whole corridors of Vong agents as the Jedi strike team neutralized the Voxyn Queen. During this mission, YVHs showed off not only their incredible combat prowess, but their tactical acuity and their ability to coordinate with both their fellow droids and living beings. YVHs were also destructive at the evacuation of Coruscant. One single droid killed a group of warriors in 4 seconds, then 5 more Vong in 5 shots, literally disarming a final warrior who was about to kill a baby. And by literally disarm, I mean he shot his arm off mid-movement. Yuuzhan Vong hunters would devastate and dominate the alien invaders at every turn, and the Vong would come to hate them almost as much as the Jedi. After the war, the popularity of YVHs, now not only used for killing Yuuzhan Vong, soared. They made their way, for example, into civilian life. Ben Skywalker, Jacen Solo's daughter Alana, and the Solo family were among many protected by individual YVHs, while other corporations built similar models, including the Ever Alert. A variant of YVHs, also known as Bug Crunchers, was used by the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances to counter the Dark Nest threat. Over 1,000 Bug Crunchers participated in the final battle of the war, the Battle of Tanupe, and although many were lost mid-transit while in space, several bug-stomping brigades helped Luke Skywalker secure the Admiral Akbar, a GFFA Star Destroyer, protecting the Grand Master as he subdued Unu Thul and Lomi Plo. And on the note of bug crunchers, one of the best aspects of the YVH was its versatility and configurability. Standard YVHs had at least one arm available for swappable weapons, everything from sonic blasters to missile launchers to more exotic guns. The droids could also be reprogrammed, as was the case with the YVA bug crunchers who were programmed to the specifications of Han Solo, or swapped into different shells with ease. There was even a YVH model mouse droid. Basically a mouse droid with YVH sensor systems and personality. It was used to sniff out masked Vong infiltrators who had been wreaking havoc across the galaxy and were incredibly useful. And I'm not kidding about that. Although ultimately Jason's YVHs were not able to protect the Sith, now known as Kaidus, from Luke, Saba, and the others, they were only defeated because the Jedi had prepared for them. By Fate of the Jedi, YVHs are still described as perhaps the most dangerous technology within the galaxy. Omen further reiterates my point from earlier that YVH droids were often a match for an armed and unrestrained Jedi, and certainly too great an obstacle for an unarmed and restrained one. Fate of the Jedi also introduces Vranin Vax, an individual injured during the Yuuzhan Vong War who has the remaining bits of his body placed within a YVH carapace. Quite an interesting individual. By mid-25 ABY, the Yuuzhan Vong had made serious inroads into the Star Wars galaxy, capturing planets as far as the Mid-Rim, partnering with the Hutts, and preparing for a strike against the core. The New Republic was struggling to not only form a meaningful resistance against the extragalactic invaders, but also to manage and transport displaced refugees to safe worlds. The Hutts were one of several groups within the galaxy working with the Vong. They specifically were helping with slave transportation and allowed the Hutts to use and even terraform their worlds as part of the war effort. In return, the Hutts were spared and given notice of supposed Vong fleet movements and New Republic targets. All of this would come to a head during the Battle of Fondor. It all starts when the New Republic realizes, with the help of Talon Card, that the Hutts have stopped spice transportation in the Corellia and Bothawi sectors. Hutt informants covertly confirm the New Republic's suspicions that those two systems are likely Yuuzhan Vong targets. However, believing themselves privy to inside knowledge, the New Republic sees this as an opportunity. They move the advanced 5th Fleet to Bothawi, while a second task force is dispatched to the nearby system of Commenor. The plan is to present Corellia as a lucrative target, then to hit the Vong with a weapon they have no knowledge of, Centerpoint Station. I'll cover Centerpoint in depth on a later date, but the basics are pretty simple. It's a very advanced space station with incredible gravity manipulation powers created by a long-dead race. It was believed to have formed the Corellia system itself, and in the Corellian trilogy is used to generate a system-wide interdiction field. Centerpoint is also able to generate gravity waves, which can be used as weapons. 7 years earlier, Anakin Solo had reactivated and taken control of the ancient station, so he is sent, along with his brother Jason, to help prepare it for battle. The New Republic's plan was to use the interdiction fields to trap the Yuuzhan Vong at Corellia. The Commenor Task Force, as well as portions of the Fondor and Kuat fleets, would, presumably with the help of Centerpoint Station, destroy the invaders, representing a massive victory. The New Republic is able to jump into space covered by a Centerpoint interdiction field because of their use of inertial momentum sustainers, created and used during the Corellian crisis 7 years ago. As this is happening, Leia is courting the Hapens, asking the usually isolationist Empire to help the New Republic, as the Vong threat now grows more serious and threatens everyone equally. Former suitor Prince Isolder convinces the Hapens to help, and a fleet is formed. The fleet is armed with New Republic interdictor cruisers, and its purpose is to stay outside of the Corellian system, preventing any fleeing Vong from jumping to hyperspace should they escape the gravity well of Centerpoint Station. Alongside the New Republic's machinations, Han Solo is helping his new friend Dromo track down his family, who were refugees of the invasion. It's eventually discovered that they're being transported captured on a ship heading for Fondor. Also tracked to that planet is a Vong cluster ship holding captured Jedi Worth Skitter. Kip Duron's famous starfighter squadron, Kip's Dozen, follow the ship to the planet. Aboard is also a Yamosk war coordinator, an extraordinarily important Vong asset. And this
is where the fun begins.
The Vong were aware of the likelihood of Hutt treachery, and the actions of the New Republic were fairly transparent, especially after traitorous Kuwati Senator Vicky Shesh warns of a trap at Corellia. Instead of springing the trap, the Vong intend to attack the vital shipbuilding planet of Fondor. To prepare, they've been growing coral skippers in Hutt space and seeding Fondor hyperlanes with Dovin basils. Given that Han and Kip's squadron have just arrived at Fondor, this seems like quite a coincidence, but it's not. First of all, the Trevi, the ship transporting Dromos family, was dumping refugees at Fondor's because the captains made a deal with the Vong. A deal meant to make sure any survivors of the invasion made their way back into harm's way. The cluster ship, on the other hand, was heading to Fondor to rendezvous with the rest of the incoming fleet. As Han identifies the Trevi and chases it, hundreds and hundreds of capital ships appear out of hyperspace, and the Falcon is only able to slip by. Joining at the rear of the formation is the cluster ship and Kip's Dozen. The Dozen and the Millennium Falcon disable the cluster ship, which is then boarded by Kip. As for the battle, the Fondor shipyards are completely unprepared, having spent some time creating the hyperspace inertial momentum sustainers for the supposed Corellia attack. Over 30 large ships, including Star Destroyers, are present but docked or under construction. Coral skippers immediately begin suiciding the shipyards. The New Republic First Fleet, which was either very close by or already at Fondor before the battle, is able to mount somewhat of a defense, but they're up against perhaps 1,000 capital ships. Reinforcements from Bothawi are unable to reach Fondor because of the degree of hyperspace obstacles, and their only option would be to return to the rim and take an unseated route, something that would take far too much time. Only the sizable Hapen force has clear passage. They jump to Fondor. Back at the battle, Kip and Ganner Rizzotti board the cluster ship and kill the Yamosk. Unfortunately, Worth cannot be saved, though several others, including a Hutt, are. On Corellia, Anakin is facing perhaps the greatest moral dilemma of his life. He is uniquely qualified to use Centerpoint Station as a weapon, and is capable of hitting the Vong fleet, even with the significant distance. But his brother argues that to strike aggressively as such would be against the Jedi Code, and a path to the dark side. By the time the Hapen fleet arrives, the Fondor shipyards have managed to mount a defense against the fighters, but are being bombarded by capital ships, which the Hapen battle dragons immediately engage. However, as the reinforcements move into range, what Leia calls a 1,000-kilometer wide beam of savage focused annihilation rips through both forces, causing extraordinary devastation and even breaking part of Fondor's moon and singeing the planet. Thrak and Sal Solo, Han's cousin, who had been with the Solo children on Corellia, had taken control of Centerpoint and inexpertly fired the weapon, destroying not only half of the Vong flotilla, but 2/3 of the Hapen reinforcements. In the end, the Yuuzhan Vong are forced to retreat. However, it's very difficult to call this a win for the New Republic. Although the losses to New Republic capital ships were minor compared to the other factions, their allies, the Hapens, were seriously damaged. Overall, it's difficult to classify the Battle of Fondor and to decide really who won. There were, however, several main effects. First, the Hutts moved from uneasy ally to the Vong to perhaps the top of their hit list. However, speaking of damaged relationships, the one between the Hapens and the New Republic was obviously heavily strained. And what's more, Hapen society would split fairly heavily over the Battle of Fondor. An interesting impact is that the Vong's view of the New Republic was changed quite significantly. They didn't realize that Thrak and Sal Solo was acting on his own, and thought the New Republic was willing to sacrifice a large portion of their fleet just to damage the Vong navy. No act of ferocity like that had been seen prior. Within the New Republic, Sal Solo rose to fame and was seen as somewhat of a hero, while Anakin was left with the question of should he have fired the repulsor. He knew that he could strike the Vong fleet without any friendly casualties, and this raises the question of when should a Jedi strike, even when striking defensively. Vision of the Future revealed a side of Myth Ra Nirodo not seen in the Thrawn trilogy. Although during his campaign he seemed like nothing more than a loyal servant of the Emperor, we learn that he was actually far more than that. In fact, post-Endor, his ultimate goal wasn't to avenge the loss of Palpatine, Vader, the Death Star, and Imperial High Command. Rather, he was preparing the galaxy for a major threat. In 19 ABY, Mara Jade was the first of the New Republic to make contact with the Empire of the Hand. The Empire of the Hand was a massive government organization set up in the unknown regions by Grand Admiral Thrawn. At the time of its discovery, it controlled at least 10 times more space than the Imperial Remnant, with few full colonies but many shipyards, fortress worlds, training centers, and bases. The Empire of the Hand was first a joint venture between Thrawn and Emperor Palpatine during the Imperial era. However, while Palpatine's goal may have been to set up a secondary government in the unknown regions, Thrawn was preparing for something much different. Again, in Vision of the Future, we learn that he was preparing for something terrible. Some sort of test, which the galaxy would need to unify against to survive. This wasn't an Imperial-only project. That much was obvious by the recruiting of Soontir Fel, who had left the Empire and joined the New Republic. It's also obvious because in 19 ABY, when rumors of Thrawn's resurrection were abound, the Empire of the Hand wasn't sure whether he would join the New Republic or the Imperial Remnant. So his real purpose for fighting the New Republic was to create one unified government. He came at it from the Imperial side because he had more Imperial resources at his disposal, and he thought the Empire was already more militarized. But this threat was so deadly that had he returned in 19 ABY, he likely would have defected instead to the New Republic, which was by far the dominant force at that time. There's also the fact that much of the Empire was too tied up in old xenophobic ideas and seemed to be a bit too interested in protecting only themselves. Thrawn, on the other hand, was interested in protecting the galaxy. What was this major threat though? What was he so scared of? Thrawn at one point said that even with the full might of the Empire and New Republic combined under his command, the galaxy might still end up losing. Stent, one of the chists within the Empire of the Hand, explains to Mara Jade that there are so many threats within the unknown region ready to strike at the galaxy, but there's something more than that. Vos Park, a high-ranking member of the Empire of the Hand and the Imperial, who actually brought Thrawn to the Emperor, tells Mara that there's a singular dark force so deadly that he's sure it will convince her to join their faction. The force isn't named, but it's almost certainly the Yuuzhan Vong. The Yuuzhan Vong were an extragalactic race prepared to invade the Star Wars galaxy. Thrawn had been aware of the existence of the Yuuzhan Vong since the Outbound Flight incident, and had likely been ascending within the Imperial hierarchy because he believed the militarized faction was the galaxy's best hope. It's no surprise then that he, together with Palpatine, established the Empire of the Hand in the unknown regions as sort of a first buffer against the alien invaders. As I said, the Yuuzhan Vong are never mentioned by name within the book, but it should be noted that Vision of the Future came out a year before Vector Prime, which kicked off the new Jedi Order. Timothy Zahn has also confirmed that Lucasfilm had approved the idea of a galactic invader by the time of his writing of Vision of the Future, and that's what he was referring to by the threats from the Empire of the Hand. In 33 BBY, 1 year before the Battle of Naboo, and also 60 years before the Yuuzhan Vong Invasion, Darth Maul is still apprenticed to Sith Lords Plagueis and Sidious. The warrior is sent to a prison station known as Cog Hive 7, where he is responsible for finding an arms dealer and retrieving a weapon for his Sith masters. Within Cog Hive 7, prisoners were pitted against each other in brutal gladiatorial death matches. By the time Maul arrived, an unknown alien had been champion for some time. Let me read an excerpt from the novel. Last night's former champion had been a particularly monstrous species that the prison's most sophisticated recognition algorithms hadn't been able to identify. 2 meters tall and cross-hatched with ritualistic scars, brandishing some kind of living staff and little else, the inmate had arrived here on Cog Hive 7 6 months earlier with a shipment of other convicts, 2 of whom it had already dispatched in transit. Since that time, the thing had defied all attempts at classification. It had screeched and chattered a language none recognized and systematically slaughtered everything pitted against it. This is clearly a Yuuzhan Vong warrior. It uses an organic staff, which is clearly a Vong amphistaff. It's unrecognized by the station's computers because it's from another galaxy. It self-mutilates and matches the Vong physically. The book actually opens up with the fight between an undercover MAUL, the newest inmate of the station, and the Vong warrior. I'm going to read a shortened version of it here, but just for the record, it's very, very brutal. Wham! Then came a punch at MAUL sideways, spinning his upper body around with the sheer force of the impact and driving him back a half step before he fully recovered his equilibrium. He spat out a tooth and wiped away the blood. The creature in front of him was a walking trophy case of previous kills. 2.5 meters high, its massive shoulders and upper torso encased in jagged plates of primitive armor that clearly had once served as the jawbone and carapace of a much larger predator. It seemed to occupy an entire corner of the prison cell. MAUL stared at the thing. The gray slope of its face was a surgeon's nightmare of ritualistic scars, organic rings, loops, and fibrous hooks with bluish sacs pulsating beneath its eyes, all of it siphoning down and inward towards a gaping, razor-toothed mouth. As a quick note here, the description of the face, including the small blue sacs here, confirmed that this was a Yuuzhan Vong warrior. Continuing, even its arms seemed to have been plucked from two different organisms. The right hand was a blunt-knuckled fist, the left an elongated spider-fingered claw. Together, they formed a mallet and blade, one made for pounding, the other for slashing. The thing reached down and picked up MAUL's incisor from the floor of the cell. Straightening up, it shoved the tooth into an empty space in its own mouth, twisting it until it lodged in place. Then it grinned at MAUL as if it was asking how he liked the sight of one of his own teeth in its mouth, another trophy for its collection. MAUL sprang at the creature, so close now that he could smell the corpse stink pouring off it like rotten meat. He fell into a reflexive series of moves. Both hands shot out and grabbed the creature by its throat, hoisting it up over his head and squeezing until he felt the deep tendons of its neck beginning to give and weaken in his grip. There was a wet, muffled click from somewhere inside the thing's chest, and a sudden glut of warm, thick, sticky fluid began spurting out from its throat. He tightened his grip, and more blood leapt up, inky, black, and viscous, pouring from its mouth and eye sockets. MAUL swung the creature around and slammed it to the floor with a sharp clang. The thing's head drooped on its broken neck, lolling sideways to expose the throbbing vessels beneath its gray flesh. He raised his foot and planted his heel into the exposed throat, ready to pulverize the trachea or whatever the thing used for an airway, with one decisive stomp. With blinding speed, the creature yanked loose and burst upright, reaching behind its back to produce what appeared to be a long bow staff. MAUL realized that the weapon, which he'd first taken to be a piece of wood or some biomechanical hybrid, was actually a living organism, a serpent whose head lashed out at lightning velocity, latching onto his face, slashing at his eyes. MAUL recoiled and his vision was gone, burying him in instant darkness. This was the second time in as many seconds that the creature had caught him off guard, and now he knew why. The creature was somehow cut off from the Force, utterly attached from the deep field of heightened sensitivity from which he was constantly drawing information about his surroundings. An acidic heaviness took hold of his optic nerves like a slow drip, seeping in, sinking deep, and he realized that he could already feel the poison taking control. Reaching up, MAUL grasped the head of the serpent staff, seizing its blunt nose and fanged mouth. His fingers took a hold of the distended upper part, twisting, wrenching, until he tore the serpent's head off its body with a moist and meaty pop. He then grabbed his opponent, reaching into its open mouth, feeling the moist warmth of its breath on his hand as he retrieved his tooth, plucking it from the thing's gums. Holding the mouth agape, MAUL crammed the serpent's severed head inside, then clamped the gray lips tight to keep the snake's head from falling out. He ripped 3 of the larger piercings from the thing's right arm and jammed them upward through the lips, bedding them back into barb hooks and fastening the mouth shut with the serpent's head still trapped inside. Inside his attacker's mouth, the snake was sinking its fangs in reflexively, squirting out venom while the attacker jerked and spasmed in vain, trying to scream. Still sightless, now holding his opponent at arm's length, MAUL inclined his own head down. He thrust forward, driving his horns into the thing's sagging eyes, feeling them crushed to jelly against his scalp. The spasm stopped, and MAUL stepped back, releasing the body and allowing it to collapse at his feet. So this is an absolutely brutal battle. MAUL is temporarily blinded, he loses a tooth, but he inflicts serious, devastating damage on the Yuuzhan Vong warrior, breaking its neck, using its own amphistaff as a weapon, destroying its eyes with his horned head, All in all, this is one of the most brutal battles in Star Wars. And it makes me wonder, how useful would have Maul been during the Yuuzhan Vong War? In this battle, he defeats an armed Vong warrior with only his hands. As instructed by Sidious, he did not use his lightsaber or the Force. And really, I think the Sith would better counter the Vong than the Jedi. The Jedi rely largely on self-reflection, given that the Vong are cut off from the Force but can still be affected by things like thrown rocks and on some occasions even Force lightning. Perhaps an army of Sith could have better repelled the invasion.
In my dreams here, I have seen the destruction of the Jedi, the death of the Republic. I've seen the temple in ruins, the Senate smashed, and Coruscant itself shattered by orbital bombardment from immense ships of impossible design. I have seen Coruscant, the seat of galactic culture, become a jungle, far more hostile and alien than any kind on Harun Call. I have seen the end of civilization. With that excerpt coming from the private journals of Mace Windu and the novel Shatterpoint, it's no surprise that many argue that the Corran Jedi Master foresaw the coming Yuuzhan Vong Invasion. Well, on Harun Call, Mace Windu never sleeps well, and he is plagued by nightmares and visions from which he cannot wake. In this one I just described, he dreams of his ultimate fear, the destruction of the Jedi and their temple, the death of the Republic, the Senate destroyed, and Coruscant itself shattered by orbital bombardment and turned into a hostile alien jungle. For those who don't know, the Yuuzhan Vong were a brutal race of alien invaders from another galaxy. They invaded the Star Wars galaxy almost 50 years after this story, and the events of the Yuuzhan Vong War do actually mirror a lot of Mace's vision. By that point, the Jedi and the Republic had been destroyed, although arguably they were both reconstituted in some form as well. The Jedi Temple was also destroyed, and during the Yuuzhan Vong Invasion, the Senate itself is ruined, and Coruscant, the seat of galactic culture, does become a jungle far more hostile and alien than any on Harun Call. That's because the Yuuzhan Vong do what's called Vong forming to planets, where they seed their natural and biotechnology, basically turning the world into a dangerous jungle alive with their own alien technology. Here's a quote from the Unifying Force which describes the state of Coruscant by the end of the war. It was raining insects on Yuuzhan Tar, the former Coruscant, once bright center, now diminished, defiled by war, transformed by the Yuuzhan Vong into a riotous garden, a seeming mishmash of ferns, conifers, and other flora, blunted what only 2 years earlier had been technological Sierra. Verdant growth nudged through the mist in the valleys that had once been canyons between kilometer-high megastructures. Coruscant is actually the most prominently Vong-formed planet in the entire galaxy, not only because it is the center, or at least the former center, of galactic civilization, but because the Vong also transform it into Yuuzhan Tar, a representation of their homeworld. Alright, so was that what Mace Windu was actually seeing? Was he having a vision of Coruscant? Well, if you look at, say for example, the Star Wars wiki, that's how they take it. Me personally, after reading Shatterpoint, I'm not so sure. Shatterpoint, which I've talked about a lot in the past couple of weeks, is pretty much the Star Wars version of Heart of Darkness. It's all about Mace Windu traveling into the jungles of Harun Call and coming to grips with the darkness within. The book is about war. There's a small proxy war going on this planet, but also a longer war between locals and the colonial forces, which has been raging for some time. But it's also in the early stages of the Clone Wars, and Mace Windu is sort of dealing with the fact that he didn't end the Clone Wars on Geonosis when he could have by killing Separatist leadership. Mace is afraid that what's happened to the Corran, the locals of Harun Call, who have become unimaginably affected by their war, being both brutal and also suffering, will be the fate of the rest of the galaxy. What's more, like the source material that it somewhat draws from, one of the major discussions in Shatterpoint is the nature of war and the nature of violence. At this point in the book, Mace is very closely associating the jungle with brutality and violence, and actually directly the dark side of the Force, whereas Mace sees civilization as the opposite of that. I've got another quote. This one from chapter 12. Mace says, being a Jedi is a discipline imposed upon nature, just as civilization is at its root a discipline imposed upon the natural impulses of sentient beings, because peace is an unnatural state. Peace is a product of civilization. The myth of the peaceful savage is precisely that, a myth. Without civilization, all existence is only the jungle. Go to your peaceful savage and burn his crops, or slaughter his herds, or kick him off his hunting grounds. You'll find that he will not remain peaceful for long. Jedi do not fight for peace. That's only a slogan and is misleading. Jedi fight for civilization, because only civilization creates peace. In my mind, stating that this is meant to be primarily, at least, an allusion to the Yuuzhan Vong Invasion is a little too on the nose. I see Mace's vision of a jungle-covered Coruscant with the Republic destroyed more being representative of his fears of what will happen during the Clone Wars. Mace sees civilization as the most important thing in the entire galaxy, the only thing that keeps the peace when it does exist. His nightmare is the pillar of civilizations being destroyed, Coruscant being bombarded, the Senate itself being destroyed, the Jedi being destroyed. Coruscant is covered in a jungle because he sees that as the opposite of peace, the natural instincts that lead to war, the literal dark side of the jungle itself. That is just my interpretation, however. It is worth noting that Matthew Stover, the author of Shatterpoint, wrote this book, of course, after the New Jedi Order and the Yuuzhan Vong War, and was actually an author within that series. And even though my interpretation sees a different purpose and meaning behind the vision, it is also possible that coincidentally, or as a secondary feature, he was also seeing the future. I don't strictly think personally that this is meant to be seeing the Yuuzhan Vong, but it's definitely possible. It just feels like the Force warning him of that when there's a much more present danger is a bit odd. That's more something that'd be thrown in as a wink and nod to fans, and I don't think this is really that kind of novel. I did, however, take a second to ask Matthew Stover on Twitter whether he could clarify, and he said that while he could tell us what he intended, he won't, because he has philosophical objections to providing out-of-universe interpretations to his story elements, because he feels like they overpower other valid interpretations. Basically meaning that while he does have something that he intended to portray in that story, he thinks other interpretations are valid, and as the author, he doesn't want to come in and be the one who provides the quote-unquote evidence to shoot down other people's interpretations. So did Mace have a vision of the Yuuzhan Vong War? You could argue yes, personally, and again, this is just my opinion, but I don't think so. I think he's instead having a nightmare and a vision about the worst possible potential of the Clone Wars, a potential which does come. The Senate, not the building, but the much more important institution itself, is destroyed, as are the Jedi. The temple is basically ransacked and the Order wiped out, democracy is destroyed, and a jungle does fall over Coruscant in a way. Not a physical jungle, but the jungle of instinct and the dark side that Mace Windu has been dealing with throughout the novel.
Today we are talking about the Coruscant Undercity, which is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting places in Star Wars. The Coruscant Undercity I've described in the past as sort of like a deep ocean. The surface provides almost no hint of the massive amount of life and space beneath. Generally, the deeper you go within the Coruscant Undercity, the stranger things get, and there are creatures who live and die without ever seeing the light of Coruscant's sun. Even on the higher level, there are seedy cantinas, crime is rampant, there are strange creatures you can't find anywhere else in the entire galaxy. The deeper you go, the stranger and potentially more disturbing things get. There are foundations which are perhaps millions of years old, but which have now been built on by towering structures thousands of feet higher. There are places which are outright ignored, and the entirety of the Undercity is far too vast to explore or document. Unsurprisingly, even at the best of times, life in the Coruscant Undercity was very, very difficult, and even more so the further you went away from the surface. Food was scarce, there were many large predators, disease was rampant, as was crime, but things only got more difficult for the citizens of Coruscant after the New Republic took control of the planet. Although it's not necessarily fair to lay blame on the government, the decades after the capture of Coruscant would see the Undercity turned into a literal hell. So the first major event I want to talk about is actually pretty minor compared to the subsequent ones, and that is the ravaging of Coruscant during the Imperial Civil War. So basically, in the weeks before Palpatine returned as part of Operation Shadowhand, there was a massive Imperial Civil War. It started off with the Empire taking back the planet from the New Republic, but then several sub-Imperial factions split apart and began a massive war. Coruscant was the center of this, and the planet was completely ravaged. Strafing runs were done against the surface, capital ships in the hundreds were knocked out of space, and well, they have to go somewhere, and there was non-stop fighting on the ground. Even Luke Skywalker at one point crashed a Star Destroyer onto Coruscant's surface without really worrying too much about the local population. Now, after the Empire was pushed back and Palpatine was defeated, the New Republic began some reconstruction efforts, although they really only focused on the planet's surface, and this is a theme that we'll see throughout this video. And in fact, this most likely made things even worse in the Undercity. How the New Republic would repair Coruscant was through the use of massive construction droids, which would basically take up debris and build new buildings. They would do so in a way that would keep things efficient on the surface, but they paid very little attention to what happened down below, and it's quite possible that entire pockets of the Coruscant Undercity would have then been cut off from the surface. What's more, the battle would have been just as bad on the Undercity as the surface, with fires, buildings collapsing, explosions, etc., etc. So that was pretty bad. But for the next decade and a half, things would really be okay on Coruscant. I mean, they wouldn't improve, and it was already a step down from the time of the Empire, but although Coruscant was attacked by Thrawn and others, nobody really successfully damaged the surface, except in small localized bombings like the New Rebellion, but really the Undercity was fine, or not made worse. However, the Yuuzhan Vong War would see the darkest days, perhaps, of history brought to Coruscant. The Yuuzhan Vong began at the Outer Rim, but pushed inwardly towards the core, with the New Republic only offering an ineffective resistance. Coruscant was the seat of the New Republic's government, and was an important planet to the Yuuzhan Vong. Thus, they launched a massive attack known as the First Battle of Yuuzhan Tar. Thousands of Yuuzhan Vong ships were able to overwhelm the New Republic's defensive forces as they beat down the planetary shield and got access to the surface. Many citizens would have died during the battle itself, while others would be injured or, worst of all, captured by the Yuuzhan Vong. The planet itself was devastated by orbital bombardments and crashing ships and the destruction of orbital facilities. But worse still was yet to come to the planet. The Yuuzhan Vong decided that Coruscant would be transformed into Yuuzhan Tar and made in the image of their homeworld. The planet underwent massive changes, not only terraforming, but the planet itself was given a new orbit in order to increase the temperature. Now, the planet would be moved back later, and these two events most likely had some catastrophic effects on the planet's structure, which would certainly be felt most acutely in the Underworld. But it's the terraforming efforts I want to talk about mostly. Yuuzhan Vong shapers began transforming the planet with native flora and fauna of the Yuuzhan Vong galaxy, many of which was not very friendly to those still living on Coruscant. The planet was covered largely in Yorick coral, and many of the city's remaining structures were destroyed to make way for the new Yuuzhan Tar. Eventually, of course, the New Republic, then the Galactic Alliance, would win the war and would recapture Coruscant, even making it again their capital. However, this was not helpful to the Undercity, and even the meager attention that had been paid to that area and the citizens who lived there was dropped in favor of surface-level reconstruction efforts. Here's a quote. "Half a kilometer down, and that's not very far for the Undercity, the structures were so crusted in Yorick coral that it was impossible to see the buildings themselves. Curtains of moss dangled hundreds of meters from ped bridges, and 10-meter stalks of fungi grew on balconies. Strange four-winged reptiles soared through the darkness, their claws clutching still struggling rodents, or limbs torn from decaying corpses. In many ways, it looked as though the Yuuzhan Vong had never left this part of the planet, and and in some ways that was true. So this is in the Legacy era, and it was so bad at this point that there was an entire program on the Perry Needmo News Hour about the plight of the individuals living still in the Undercity. The program is discussed in a few of the Fate of the Jedi books, but I've just got a few quotes from allies. Keep in mind, all of this here is from fairly high levels within the Undercity. It's much worse the deeper you go. This place has been forgotten. There's no order, no civilization here. There's no health care for beings trying to eke out an existence. There's no stopping the sale of drugs, or illicit activities, or investigation of murder. Violent deaths are an everyday occurrence, and the bodies are looted before they become food for ferals. This is a dark place, a frightening place, and it's just easier to forget about it since we are not forced to see it every day. But things were due to get worse, and much, much worse. At this point, the Coruscant Undercity, as we've discussed, was largely alive and ready to be corrupted. This corruption would be brought to the planet in the form of Abeloth, a near demigod and the harbinger of the apocalypse. Abeloth could cause psychosis. She could break the minds of people on a planet and dominate them just by being there. And that's what began to happen on Coruscant. This effect magnified not only by the many people, but by the still many living creatures from the planet's transformation into Yuuzhan, especially in the Undercity. The beginning bits of this transformation were noted during the Perry Needmo News Hour, where we learned that the Undercity looked worse than ever. It seemed as though the Yorick coral, slash vines, and other plant growth, far from being beaten back, had all but taken over. Whereas before the inhabitants had tended to shy away from cams, now the Holo film crew, who had received hazard pay for obtaining the footage, captured gangs brutally and openly terrorizing those unfortunate enough to be overtaken. Needmo ended by saying one thing is tragically certain: it is a darker and far more dangerous place than ever before. Abeloth fed on fear, so this transformation continued to make her more powerful, and as the Jedi began to discover her deception, she created massive supervolcanoes across Coruscant, which, again, disproportionately affected the Undercity. I've got one final quote which will sum up the state of things at the end of Fate of the Jedi. The volcanic activity has stopped everywhere on the planet, though it will probably be years before we even have a basic survey of the damage to the Undercity. The team has identified over 100,000 sites that need investigation down there, and it's not easy to tell whether we're looking for a magma well, a terrorist attack, or a building collapse. This next part is kind of funny. Tell him about the death clouds, Kip Duron suggested. Dorvin's face grew dim. That's right. Clouds of ash, poisonous gas, and toxic smoke are still spreading through the Undercity. We think Underdweller casualties are huge. They could be in the billions already. So when I said Coruscant was transformed into a literal hell, some of you probably thought that I was just clickbaiting or whatever, but let's just check up. We have literal, active mega volcanoes and lava fields. We have, and I quote, death clouds. We have people being torn apart, mentally and physically, due to the presence of an angry demigod. All of that on a planet which has already been almost unimaginably ravaged by war, and even before that was in a pretty crappy state. You do not want to be in the Coruscant Undercity at any point, but you definitely do not want to be there about 40 years after the Battle of Yavin. So, during the Yuuzhan Vong War, a squad of B2s beat up a bunch of Yuuzhan Vong, and that's all we have to talk about, so thanks for tuning in. Well, that's not quite it, but it was the reason for their awards, so if that's all you're interested in, well, now you know. For everyone else, let's cover the basics. The Super Battle Droid was really an incredible advancement over the B1. It was menacing, almost 2 meters tall, and extremely heavy and powerful. It was encased in a blaster-resistant armored shell, and it had built-in configurable weapons. Here's what the Essential Guide to Warfare says about the model. Despite their limitations, mostly related to the fact that they were essentially dumb Terminators, and those are my words, B2s largely solved the Trade Federation's problems, adding needed muscles to the rank of B1s, also proving adaptable to a number of combat roles, mounting missiles in place of their forearm cannons, swimming to reach their targets, or strapping on rocket packs and taking to the skies to intercept gunships. However, as we all know, the droid armies of the CIS were all shut down by the end of the Clone Wars, as Vader turned off the universal control signal on Mustafar. This led to, and I quote now the Essential Guide to Droids, the end of the Super Battle Droids' 3 standard years of dominance. However, that same source continues, telling us that the droid's life doesn't end there. Battle droids across the galaxy were eventually recovered, I'm assuming especially following the days of the Empire, and were often employed by crime lords and other private individuals. I assume, as we get to later, that battle droids also made their way into the hands of planetary militias. The B-2's total lack of self-preservation instincts, combined with its integrated weaponry, relatively simple design and programming, plus its thick armor, made it an obvious choice for a variety of duties, from bodyguarding to basic planetary defense. And this takes us to the Yuuzhan Vong War, an era which saw extragalactic invaders ravage the galaxy. They didn't capture planets and install governors or suppress local populations. Rather, they destroyed everything in their sight, ravaging planets and changing them to fit their specific needs. The Vong were opposed by not only the New Republic, but eventually basically everyone across the galaxy who could take up arms. And on this note, the Essential Guide to Droids tells us that during the Vong War, a platoon of super battle droids dubbed the Orange Panthax beat back an occupation force of Yuuzhan Vong fire breathers on the planet Mentessa, earning the unit a special commendation by the Galactic Alliance's Chief of State, Cal Omis. So this is admittedly a pretty short blurb, but is interesting and actually tells us a lot if you read between the lines. First of all, a Panthac is a feline predator native to the planet Mentessa, suggesting to me at least that this wasn't some roving battle droid squad, but was probably serving the planetary government. Yuuzhan Vong fire breathers are, as the name would suggest, basically a Vong biot that was sort of a fire-breathing siege weapon. The heat-resistant armor of the B-2 would have been very helpful in this case. We also know, based on the fact that the commendation came from Galactic Alliance Chief of State Cal Omis, that the battle may have occurred after evac, which was in the final year of the war. Now, it is possible that Omis retroactively gave this award, but the fact that the Vong had pierced the inner rim at this point suggests that it was probably pretty late in the war. In the late stages of the Vong invasion saw the Vong beginning to bleed resources, especially ground troops, which they had trouble recovering due to their overextension, which was almost inherent in their galaxy-wide invasion. Protecting a fertile inner rim planet from Vong forming and perhaps the establishment of a new ship womb or biot producer was certainly worthy of commendation. As a general note, droids were actually a great tool against the Yuuzhan Vong, although the B-2 may not have been great against Vong warriors because of their tendency to fight up close. Obviously, the YVH is well known for being badass, but other less sophisticated droids could also be used to great effect, mostly because they infuriated the Vong, who saw not only droids, but all machinery as an affront to their religion and their gods. The Vong would go out of their way to destroy machines, even if it meant losing assets, resources like food, or time. The New Republic were so eager to take advantage of this that they even at times faked droids, as they did at the Battle of Ithor. Here's a quote from Dark Tide 2, Rune. They defended it with automated blasters and peopled it with droid shells, cobbled together from spare parts and just enough circuitry to allow the machines a little motion. They knew that using what appeared to be droids to defend the target would likely unhinge the Yuuzhan Vong and get them committed to a frenzy of destruction. Knowing the effectiveness of droids, it would have been really cool for the new Jedi Order to have a subplot about trying to reactivate the CIS droid armies, or just generally to somehow recover droid caches, but that's what happens when you start a series in '99, same time as The Phantom Menace.